So, if you didn't get a chance to listen, I was going through. I mean, the physiology is it does take a little bit of time to go through to really get it right, I think. And I did the part with the liver, and I may very well have finished. I basically, yeah, it was about here. And so the last thing that I was looking at, because I just quickly looked at the recording. If you did not, I couldn't do the recording because my wife and I, one of those rare occasions we actually could do something during the day together, getting our car inspected.
Oh, you guys went on a date?
Yes, we went sourcing, which means we go to thrift stores and look for stuff to sell. It was that kind of a date. And I spent plenty of money for lunch.
Where'd you go?
McDonald's on 65.
Stop.
Hey,
You gotta treat her better.
she'd rather have that. I mean, we've gone to. She goes, we can make this a lot cheaper than buying this stuff here. She's very frugal. Not as frugal as her daughter. We joke about her daughter. She throws around nickels like manhole covers. She never spent a penny. She saved more money than I did in a career after like working for 5 years. Go figure. I digress. We ended with this. This is the enterohepatic circulation. Quick review. This is all about making bile. We make it it's one of the ways we use cholesterol in membranes of cells, and we use cholesterol basically as an emulsifying agent. Because remember, fats aren't bonds. Fats are just glopped together, for lack of a better word. And so you need a fat to get in between it. That's what an emulsifying agent does. Very simple. When you go back to cooking 101, when you make a quote creamy salad dressing, what makes that or mayonnaise hold up is you have emulsifiers in it. So you use something with lecithin, typically like mustard or egg yolks, or what that gives it that creamy kind of a texture. So you're using fats to assemble and disassemble fats, if you want to think of it that way. They make it here. It travels along, playing a pivotal role in breaking down fats so they can eventually be carried out. And then if about 95% of it is reabsorbed and recycled and made into more bile. Okay. The early anti-cholesterol drugs tried to block that reabsorption and and basically force the liver to use more cholesterol in the hopes of lowering it. Trouble is, it put a big strain on the liver. The newer agents work differently, with less side effects. That was the part I left you at. That was there. And so the, the hardest thing with the liver is it easily goes wrong. It's your main structure for detoxification. It's that one. The beauty of the organ is it's as rapidly replicative as any organ you have in your body. We used to have liver transplants were from, obviously from people who had died and had to be transplanted quickly. Now they can do live liver transplants, even in adults. And it will, there's been so much changes, but where are the big problems? Viruses, particularly bloodborne viruses like Hep C and HIV, drug toxicity. You could probably include that with alcohol, which surely is the greatest source of problems with your liver. Uh, if you're a mushroom person, most of us buy them in the store, which is the way to buy them, unless you know what you're doing. My wife and I, a couple of years ago, briefly joined the Western Pennsylvania Mushroom Society, went foraging with them. It's very interesting. There's a lot of very interesting mushrooms around here.
Went foraging for shrooms.
Yeah, sure. Not shrooms.
I thought you liked shrooms.
I like.
Did you tell
I was looking for morels, thank you very much, which are delicious and hard to find around here, only at certain times.
Didn't you tell us you go in college?
In college, yeah, we did a few mushrooms.
You went foraging there as well.
You have a better college life than I do.
We go to Rebel.
Yeah.
You see an IUP? Yeah.
It's not the first time I've seen that happen. It was a different day and age.
Where did you go?
When I was doing that, I was at Lehigh University mostly.
I'm gonna transfer.
Yeah, and at the time, what was I thinking? It was an all boys school for the first 2 years. I was nuts. I need to have my head examined. I mean, and hey, you're asking a question. So I mean, there was so much stuff. Everybody goes away on spring break. We didn't have to. We put a poster up from an album cover. You could go anywhere you wanted, but having to move.
You're bad.
You're bad.
And so they thought it was going to mutate your genes and everything. Look up a Harvard, an infamous Harvard professor named Timothy Leary, and a famous song about Timothy Leary's dead. Okay, moving on. So all of these, so the watchword is be very careful if you're picking mushrooms in your yard. It's a bad idea. Okay, very, very careful because it can damage the liver. And once it's damaged, it becomes inflamed. Then you start to get fibrosis and fatty deposits. And at that point, it doesn't function. It backs up the blood flow coming into it. And as you can see, that now we're seeing a lot of regeneration. There's been some points, but I had a number of patients who were candidates for liver transfer, and some were too late. Famous when it first started. My first cousin lost her husband, who wasn't even 30, of non-drug related liver disease, some type of inherent, born with a liver disease. It's here. And periodically we're still in contact. The gallbladder is really not a lot of functionality. Does it store and concentrate bile? Yes. Is it useful to have it? Yes. Is it essential to have it? No. The problem is, for surface area, it has, just like we see consistently anatomically, those little nooks and crannies, and periodically stuff gets stuck. There's a lot of things that are associated diet-wise that can lead to that. I'm trying not to offend anybody when I do this thing that we used to do with it. So please don't take it the wrong way. So biliary calculi are another name for gallstones. Cholesterol, absence of bile salts, they're obstructive. And those crystals, again, like uric acid crystals in the kidney or in your bloodstream from gout, are not innocent looking crystals like salt crystals. They have sharp edges and they damage struck. Yes, sir.
Is this so? Could this be genetic, or is this mostly case by case?
There's not mostly genetic. There's
Okay.
certainly a genetic. It has a lot to do with different. And I'll give you a couple of anecdotes about it. So it can obstruct flow of bile from just reading through this with you. The crystals are and the crystals can be anywhere. They don't just be in the gallbladder. They can be in any of the ductal structures. They can also block the common bile duct and cause the kidney to backflow and effectively cause something called a pseudocyst, and not the kidney, but the pancreas, I beg your pardon, to backflow and cause a pancreatic pseudocyst, which can be life-threatening. So they're nasty. Okay, and what happens is, because you're not getting again, ultimately a plumbing problem, if it backs up and goes back to the liver, then it's unable to rid your system of sufficient bilirubin, and jaundice, in this case, ensues. And certainly liver failure can be associated with this. It used to be strictly surgical. The surgery is a little bit easier now because it can be done laparoscopically. You don't have to make the big incision and open it up. But there's medications, lithotripsy, which is using high frequency ultrasonic sound waves, are used for this, and perhaps more extensively for kidney stones, which we'll get to in kidney. So it's and basically the patient goes sedated but not asleep into a fairly large bathtub, for lack of a better way to describe it. Okay, we used to use like a Hubbard tank or an enlarged Whirlpool tank because the water would obviously assist with the sound wave transmission to be able to do that. Lasers, etc., things like that. Couple of things about it. So in general, this is the part I didn't want to be offensive about, but I'll tell you what we were schooled in. So accept it. We call it the 5 Fs. Okay, fair, female, 40, fertile, and that F word that means not skinny. I don't use that F word. The other one I use. So it was heavily set. Female, fair, 40, and fertile. Those, when you saw somebody come in with upper right quadrant pain, and they fit that description, that was your slam dunk. Okay, there are a lot of other reasons for it. Some people, it's dietary. Okay, and that would be over ingestion of fats that can cause it. A very famous soccer manager who was just got released from his contract was out. Antonio Conte, very very successful, and a slender man in his 40s, comparatively. My stepdaughter had to have an emergency gallbladder removal, but okay, she was very slender, but she went through 2 cycles of IVF in order to have my first of those 2 grandchildren that you see pictures of. And because of that, they use so many steroidal based hormones that it caused her gallbladder to become alarmingly inflamed. And shortly after having significant problems with bleeding postpartum, she had to have that gallbladder removed. And I was like, yes, sir.
It happened to my mom.
Right.
She had like me and my brother who's younger, and like 2-3 years later, she had to get her gallbladder removed because my brother's birth was like he almost hung himself with his umbilical cord.
Just,
So she had to get it removed because it crystallized or whatever. And I remember that like clear as day because like she had to get the whole thing removed, and I was really worried. It's like 6 years old.
Well, as kids, we just in the old, and then they probably were doing them laparoscopically then. But you used to make a what we call a high lap. So it's an incision that goes from your umbilicus down to your belly button, and you could kind of easily get under it that way. There are still a lot of gallbladder disease is relatively common. It's less genetic than I think the dietary part is ethnic in a lot of ways, depending on the culture. So I think the foods have a role to it. There's certainly a genetic component in certain areas. I think you would find if you studied it, I have not. So, which brings us to a much more relevant. It's a double duty organ for digestive. We're looking at the materials that are exocrine glands that utilize the pancreatic duct and feed into the intestine. It's an essential organ. You can't live without it. Not only because of the digestive aspect, but most importantly with the endocrine, which we've already covered. So the exocrine function, pancreatic juices, these secretory cells which surround the pancreatic duct produce, and we're going to see this again and again, just like we saw in the blood, proenzymes, inactivated proteolytic enzymes. If they were active, you would autodigest. The tragedy of pancreatitis, most people who get pancreatitis have one thing in common: alcohol. It inflames their palate. So typically, one of the things we see a lot of with acute pancreatitis is alcohol disease. My first wife had it postoperatively. They had to remove a tumor that was slightly smaller. It was probably around a baseball-sized tumor from her abdomen. She was taking an agent to, like I am, like tumor necrosis factor. She was taking Embrol. Been around for a long time. But because she has a disease called neurofibromatosis, which is the disease of the elephant man, which there's many presentations, she grew, fortunately, a benign tumor effectively behind her bowel, but adherent to the pancreas. The surgeon removed it successfully. She went home 3 days later. She spent another week in the hospital in absolute obscene pain because her pancreas started to release these enzymes into her abdomen and she started to autodigest. There's nothing they can do surgically. All you can do is try to quell it. I've never seen anyone in so much pain. It's god awful horrible. Okay? So what they secrete are these zymogen granules plus a variety of other substances and a lot of water and a lot of bicarbonate. This has got to neutralize the stomach acid. So it kind of looks like this. We're not going to really deal with the insulin, the Langerhans cells, the alpha and beta cells. We dealt with them already. They're busy cells. Pancreatic cells have a lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum, extensive amounts of it because they're producing proteins and exocytosing them into these various ducts. So the ones in the actual acinar cells, sort of this little cup area that is, of which there's multiple ones of, produce the zymogens, and then the ductal cells secrete bicarbonate and water. So you can see it microscopically. What's in pancreatic juice? Alkaline pH 8 neutralizes the chyme. Electrolytes, mostly bicarb, and those enzymes. The enzymes, and we're going to get into those today and hopefully conclude this. This is where the bulk of your digestion comes from. So far, we haven't done a whole lot of physiological digestion in the alimentary canal. We've had salivary amylase, and we haven't touched starches since. We have lingual and gastric lipases. That's it for fats. We have pepsin. Now we're going to get everything else. More proteases that are inactive, amylase for carbs, lipases for lipids, and nucleases for nucleic acids. So again, here are just some of the names. We'll look at them again. Enteropeptidase, bound to the plasma membrane of the duodenal epithelial cells, and that activates the principal pancreatic protease, okay, trypsinogen to trypsin. The ogen, again, is the inactive form. So the enteropeptidase is more of the catalyst to make that occur. Then trypsin is then the catalase for carboxypeptidase, chymotrypsinogen. So it goes from the pro form or the ogen form to its active form. So the big player here is enteropeptidase activating trypsin, and then the trypsin begins to do the rest of the work. So you can see these that are there. The enteropeptidase basically is within the small intestinal cells, lining cells, and then activating the trypsin, which is catalytic into it of itself with some positive feedback, and then chymotrypsin and carboxypeptidase. And this is the anatomical, the hepatopancreatic ampulla, where the bile coming from the liver and the pancreatic duct fuse, opens the sphincter. There's a tiny duct that's called the accessory duct, which is a little more distal to it. Nothing really about that. These are, again, neural controls, so nerves, stretch receptors, whether ones that are local or ones that are more global or more systemic, as well as hormonal controls that are there. The major hormones, again, for the small intestine, cholecystokinin and secretin. They play the role in cholecystokinin, even though it has multiple roles, stimulates the bile. It's basically your intestine. When stuff enters there, it's sending a signal to the pancreas, get busy, we've got company. And to the liver, get busy, we've got company. Come on down. I feel like I always want to be on Price is Right. Just drives me crazy. You know, the person who's last should always win. Unless somebody gets lucky. You know, the person before them says 8:49 and they go 8:48. Like, what are you doing? I want to throw something at the set. I have a little foam brick for Steeler games.
Oh, that's probably good. I just swear that usually works.
I do that as well. So, enterohepatic circulation, that increases bile. Secretin, okay, exposed to hydrochloric acid and chyme, gallbladder to bile. Okay. Bile is stored in the gallbladder and released only with its contraction. So they show you in this sort of little diagrammatic thing, and you can scroll through it, what it does. Secretin released by the acidic chyme, cholecystokinin by proteins and fats in the chyme. So the acidity is the secretin. The constituents are more of the cholecystokinin, causes the following events: inducing cholecystokinin as well as working on bile, enzyme-rich pancreatic juices, secretin, bicarbonate, vagus nerve plays a role, bile secretion to the liver, bile salts returning are the most powerful stimulus for bile secretion. So as things start to move through, that reabsorption phenomena plays a role. Gallbladder contraction plays a role, and also playing a role in relaxing the sphincter. Okay, cholecystokinin causes that sphincter to relax so those secretions can enter. Voila. So that's the generic kind of view of what the organs do. Now we're going to get to the role of the small intestine. Okay, just checking. Okie dokie. Voila. Part C. So we should easily get through this and maybe even begin our journey into the wonderful world of the kidney. I have fun with this. I've got to do this for 3 more years.
Hey, that was your score.
If I remember my teaching philosophy, whenever you apply for a teaching job, if you do that in the future, they want a statement of your teaching philosophy. If I'm not enthusiastic, why would you be? One sentence.
Amen.
I've got Mackenzie's interviewing someplace.
I don't know. Last time I saw she was in New York.
She emailed me like last night or this morning about that. I hope she's successful. I'd be looking for. So here we did the anatomy, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, blah 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 blah. Don't worry about the blood supply. Aha, surface area. So as you remember that this tube that looks not a whole lot different if you stretch it out from a 25-foot garden hose, okay, and you split it, is basically, if you stretched it all out and had all the surface area, it would be a tennis court. So you have a lot of stuff. And this is what makes it, okay? It's all about the surface area. It is, you only need a small portion of this to be satisfactory. And it's obviously desirable to have all of it, but we have, I mean, you're getting an abundance of about 20 feet of small intestine. And unfortunately, a lot of people who suffer with a god awful disease, okay, there are 2 of them that affect us in the autoimmune sphere. Crohn's disease, which can strike anywhere in the alimentary canal, and I hate that. Now I gotta look at it. Oh, it's terrible because I dated a girl who had that. Here, I'm getting here. Ulcerative colitis. I remember. Thank goodness. Good way to remember things is start writing things out, and all of a sudden it comes. You visualize it, triggers receptors. Ulcerative colitis. She had the ulcerative colitis, and we were dating in high school. I mean, she always had a lot of digestive problems that didn't manifest themselves. And then I she went her own way, and I went my way, and she got back in touch with me when I started teaching because she saw my name someplace. We guys were chatting, and got back. It was a let's get back together call. Of course, I was married already, but I digress. Okay. Yeah.
You're just such a pet.
No. I think she was a very lonely person, to be very honest with you. She'd already had her entire colon removed. Good God. And a terrible, estranged from her daughter, and an abusive husband who she was divorced. I mean, it was, but I couldn't stand talking to her. What a downer. I mean, I felt bad. It was just sad. Not such a catch. If you ever meet my wife, she'll tell you. She spends most of her, I think her happiest thing that she does is yell at me. Oh, you're having a good mood. You're yelling at me. So all of these structures that facilitate this, and the idea is we have so much of it. And again, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are where you have to resect these. They go through multiple surgeries. And it's more common than you think. The whole idea is the arrangement, not so much of the folds, the villi, millions of them, a millimeter, very, very tiny, barely visible, little nubs. Each of those nubs have a lymphatic structure, you might remember it from anatomy, called a lacteal, surrounded by a capillary bed. So when it's absorbed into that finger-like nub, The water-soluble particles go into the capillary bed. The fatty and thicker particles go into the lacteal and into the lymphatic system. It's facilitated by this. Surrounding that nub, and you'll see the illustration, is what they call a brush border, microvilli. So microvilli are like, where you have all those little nooks and crannies, those finger-like projections that enhance surface area. Each of those cells along those microvilli, which are effectively extensions of the plasma membrane, in like microfingers, and surrounding the cells that are adherent to them or embedded in there are what are called brush border enzymes. They're the final step. They take the dipeptide and make it into amino acid. They take the lactose and make it into glucose and galactose, sucrose into glucose and fructose. So it can all be absorbed. It's that final step that's so critical. And that's accomplished by it's brush border and brush border enzymes that are bound. Remember, we talked about the 6 different things that you have proteins embedded in a membrane. I mean, you have signaling proteins and cell attachment and identification and blah, 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 and all that type of stuff. One of them were enzymes. This is where the enzymes were. So bound enzymes to that brush border are extraordinarily significant here. And you saw that illustrated. Here's the lacteal. So here's the finger, and each one of these cells, interspersed with goblet cells, simple columnar, you see the brush border. And it's all about surface area. It's a very busy cell. It's columnar. It has a lot of endoplasmic reticulum. It has a lot of lysozymes. And a lot of mitochondria, of course. They are so busy. These are certainly the most rapidly replaced cells in the body. Every 3 to 6 days, the whole set, your alimentary canal, you get a whole new one. So you're replacing 1 billion or more cells every single day in your gastrointestinal tract alone. That's the hidden thing. People don't realize that. I said it with feces. It's 1/3 water, 1/3 undigested food, 1/3 cells. So as much as it sounds like they couldn't do that, if you're not eating solids, you still end up going. I found that out with my first surgery. I really like something to eat. Well, you can't eat until you go to the bathroom. Whoa! I'm not getting any food. There's something wrong with this picture. Give me a burger. I'll feel. They just wouldn't. They wouldn't play ball. Here's what it looks like. So you can see the columnar cells, and though you can't discern the brush border, you just kind of make it out there. Here it is. Lots of mucus. The brush border. There's the apical membrane of the cell with these protruding, even though these are just intracellular extensions, and they're collectively they're called enterocytes for the absorption. So we had pits in the stomach. Now we call them crypts. Okay, between the villi. So 5 main types of cells that are found there. The enterocytes, the main epithelium, simple columnar. Again, just like the stomach, a lot of tight junctions because you don't want stuff slipping between the cracks because that really damages things. You have potentially caustic substances getting through. It's protective in there. It's just what it is. So, the design is such that it's limiting in that. So they absorb nutrients and electrolytes. I'll buy that. The crypts play a role. That's where you find a lot of additional glandular-like exocrine glandular structures that are watery, have a certain amount of mucus. It's fairly alkaline, help to move the chyme along. Goblet cells, of course. The enteroendocrine cells, again. So again, this is where, and the ones we saw principally was gastrin in the stomach with a little bit of histamine and a little bit of serotonin. Now that we get into small intestine, we have cholecystokinin and secretin found scattered in the villi and also the crypts. Paneth cells are a little bit different. They're defensive. They're immunological. Okay? And the epithelium every 2 to 4 days in this location. So it's a little bit in the stomach, a little bit longer, maybe in the large intestine, a little bit longer, probably the most rapid here of the typical gastrointestinal cells. So, because this is a contact point with the outside world, effectively this is material that enters here still has the potential to be laden with bacteria and viruses and other invaders or toxins. You have the mucosa-associated lymphoid cells. They're aggregated nodules in the lamina propria called Peyer's patches. Greater in the distal part, bacteria gradually increase and eventually find their way and colonize in the small and the large intestine, where they play a really important role that we'll get to. Plasma cells and IgA, the submucosa more glandular for the alkaline mucus that's there. The big part, this is the single biggest area. If you know somebody who's being treated with radiation or chemotherapy for cancer, this is inevitably they get diarrhea. Where are the most sensitive cells? The intestinal crypts. It's a course that they're doing away with, and Dr. Buxton and I have been co-teaching radiation biology for the nuclear med students, which I guess they're changing it all around. And so I do the biology part. He does more of the radiation, the physics part, which I know nothing. So that's why they get all of those. No question about it. So gastrointestinal side effects are just such a big player in medicine and in treatment, particularly when you have to treat things aggressively. They're really problematic. So here are the juices: distension or irritation. The big stimulus: acidity, hypertonicity. Okay. The slightly alkaline and isotonic with regard to blood plasma is what the juices. So they're, again, pH 8, a little bit more alkaline, relatively isotonic, fine, largely of water and a bunch of other stuff that's in there. So in addition to the 4 to 8 hours from the stomach, 4 to 8, you have 3 to 6 hours in the small intestine. So it takes some time. So whatever you had is probably just about concluding. If you had something for dinner last night, it's probably fairly well absorbed by now, you would think. Unless it's engineered, in medicine, sometimes we engineer them to be absorbed more slowly. So all of these, okay, are the bile, the bicarb, the major, not the brush border enzymes, come from the liver and pancreas. We already pointed that out. The brush border enzymes, which are membrane bound, again, they're the final step. So the entry, slowly, okay, you don't want that hypertonic stuff to suck water out of the bloodstream. That's one of the reasons. So a short burst of hypertonicity, the acidity, it mixes with those, and then you have a variety of reflexes that control the movement that are there. And how does it move around? This is where it's segmentation. Not so much peristalsis, but peristalsis with that back and forth kind of segmentation. Intrinsically, moving into the endpoint, which is the ileocecal valve, again, increased by parasympathetic, decreased with sympathetic. Okay. It increases, there's a hormone called motilin that's also produced late in that phase. And then they call them migrating motor complexes. And so it's about 2 hours for an absolute trip if you want to think about it. If we talk about a whole meal, it's a little bit longer. And so what's left, bacteria, debris, are moved toward the large intestine. See you later. Ileocecal valve, reflexly controlled, okay, etc. Not a whole lot else. Now, large intestines is fairly non-functional. It's a lot more about, how should I say it? It's really just playing a role for the most part with getting the feces the right consistency to expel. So, and again, it's all about too fast or too slow. When we talk about diarrhea and vomiting and those kinds, it's moving too fast for the water to be absorbed. It's very loose. If it's too slow, constipation is too hard. because there's too much time in the water keeps absorbing. So it's different problems at different ages. Older folks, more on the constipation side. Younger folks, more on the diarrhea side. Just as a broad brush. The anatomy of it starts, remember, with the cecum. That's where the first, which the appendix protrudes from. Basic role of the appendix, again, probably just stores bacteria to reseed the colon after colitis or severe diarrhea, because they play a role in electrolytes, and particularly B vitamins and vitamin K. There's a lot of that to go. So the bacteria, and these days we're so into probiotics. And it's really a good idea. We all those types of things. Before we had those available to us, folks like me who prescribed a lot of antibiotics for a lot of infections, we're always telling people, okay, you got to eat yogurt, you've got to have acidophilus milk, cottage cheese, those kinds of things. Personally, I was more of a yogurt fan myself. Just plain yogurt. Spaceballs movie. We should show it one day. Pick a Monday and just do it. We should just do
Instead of a final, you can have the final online, and we'll show up for the time, and you can have
Spaceballs the movie.
Yeah. Sounds like a win-win for us. We get an online final.
Rick Moranis, who hardly did any other TV after that, after Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. I'm surrounded by assholes. What's your name? Lieutenant John Asshole. That's right, he's an asshole. I'm surrounded by assholes.
I love the Schwartz scene at the end. They fight with their Schwartz.
Hell, Lone Star. I see your Schwartz is as big as mine. Oh, God. I'm terrible. And we're not doing hemorrhoids. We're not doing them. We're not doing them. We're not doing them. We're not doing them. Yeah, appendicitis, peritonitis. Okay. It's a sterile cavity. Anything that ruptures for whatever reason. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a gunshot or a stab wound, but that's certainly part of it. Most of the time we see peritonitis, ruptured appendix, or a tumor, unfortunately. Genitourinary or gastrointestinal tumors, when they rupture and it leaks food contents that are so rich in gram-negative bacteria that we see significant problems that are there. Not a whole lot with regard to that's anatomy. The flora itself, immensely outnumber our own cells. They're so much more, and there's so many of them. So they colonize the entire length of the colon. Fermentation for the indigestible materials, not a tremendous amount, but B complex and vitamin K are all part of that are there. Beneficial bacteria outnumber and suppress. That's why we hear about C. diff. When we take antibiotics, that will offset that delicate balance. The epithelial cells, if you're from your immune, recruit to mucosa to sample. Okay, so there's a lot of sampling of the environment that's in there. So it's another one of those critical areas where you're basically keeping your immune system in tune, sampling it, developing IgA, etc. for it. There's so much about this that people are really into studying all of those things. If they're into it, this is such a big problem. C. diff and its opposite number its similar number called VRE. So for those going into a healthcare area, Clostridium, everybody will encounter it. VRE stands for vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus faecalis. And they effectively, in a lot of populations, hospitalized, nursing home, long-term care, they ping pong. You get rid of one, the other one comes. Get rid of that one, C. diff comes back. It's awful. I had it. Okay? For a variety of reasons, most likely because my first wife was an RN who ran the old Wilkins house in Wilkinsburg when it was a nursing home on evenings and weekends. And I mean, there's so much of that going around. There's so many people incontinent and a mess that you almost have to take off your clothes before you should change everything and lose it and not bring it home. It's probably how I got it. I wasn't very healthy, obviously, at that time either. Okay, and so it's really nasty that are there 12 to 24 hours, vitamins, water, electrolytes. That's kind of what's being reclaimed. So it's again, it's non-essential tissue. It's comfort, but it's not essential. And a lot of times, what will happen is this is when we see ostomies, and sometimes they're temporary. It's almost a way of letting stuff pass out without compromising it. So you saw a lot of that in abdominal surgery. It's called exteriorizing. So you would put a temporary ostomy and reverse it so that food wouldn't pass through an area that was operated on. Sometimes you couldn't reverse it. And diverticulums are weaknesses in the smooth muscle wall, which is much more common than you think as people get older. And again, things can get trapped in there, rupture, leak, and they can be life-threatening as well. And there's a lot of people who suffer from variations of IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. I don't do the defecation stuff. And we'll stop there. All right, we're going to do the physiology, which will probably take about half an hour or so, 40 minutes, and then introduce urinary and be done soon. Thanks a bunch.
Dr. I just got a notification. Mark Jackson officially requested a trade for the Baltimore Ravens.